Pilla was baring his teeth so hard that the sheikh told him to be careful or he would break his jaw. We were all shaking finely. To somehow revive our icy limbs, we stomped our feet on the floor of the truck until we were completely exhausted. The diesel engine of our Mercedes kept rumbling. We envied the driver in front, who was protected from the cold by the cab of the truck. We blew steam out of our mouths, cursing the monstrous cold. That's how it was for us in March. It should have been spring by now, but instead it was winter again. A merciless, cruel winter, so cold that everything turned to brittle ice. The bluish-white snow crunched like glass underfoot. Wrapped from head to toe, we traveled in open lorries. To keep warm, we began to pummel each other, making the scramble. But it was no use. We were still shivering and could hardly speak because our lips were frozen. We couldn't take our gloved hands off our noses, which hurt with every breath. That evening, for the first time, we heard the rumbling of the front, and at once the fear of that wild monster gave us goosebumps and strained all our nerves. Now the frost was not only on our outside, but also on our inside. The dreary leaden sky in solid cloud cover was cold, monotonous, utterly merciless. Everywhere you looked there was only snow, an endless expanse of snow. We reached a patch of wooded ground and passed a burnt log hut. Beside the ruins stood a bare, black, churred tree, and from the tree, like unseasonably grown giant fruit, hung 3 bodies, completely naked, frozen to the hardness of stone. Chins pressed against unnaturally long necks. The bodies dangled from the ropes, swaying in the breeze. One of them belonged to a woman. The icy wind played with her flaxen-colored hair, which reached to her hips and covered her breasts. She was dangling, tied by a sturdy bough overhanging the road. Horrified, we stared at the blue-covered legs and our throats constricted. I had to tilt my head to keep from hitting those feet. Towards evening, we came to a small village that had been partially destroyed, but there were several undamaged houses in which we could make a good stand. Baggage wagons and sledges were everywhere, and a few of our soldiers in fur overcoats were acting as sentries. We hopped down, stiff and clumsy. A lieutenant came up, and our immediate superior, a wiry little sergeant, gave a report. The lieutenant cast a fleeting glance at us. "So you're the new guys. Go over there, to that group of houses. Report to the non-commissioned officer. He'll put you somewhere with the others. And don't waste any time getting to bed. We move into position at dawn." The hut assigned to us was filled and smelled of sweat and mint tea. The musty air was so heavy you could cut it with a knife, but at least it was warm, even nauseatingly warm. There was no sign of the former owners. They had either escaped or been killed. We found a place among the last and huddled on the floor. There was nowhere to stretch out. The others barely paid attention to us. For supper, there were a couple of thick sausage sandwiches left over from our camp rations and a mug of hot tea. The tea tasted of mint, and God knows what else. It was pitch dark outside, but behind the front line we could always see flashes of light, as during a grand fireworks display. The rumbling did not cease, the window panes kept shaking, and the flame of our smoldering candles flickered uneasily. I began to long for morning to come, with the devilish mess ahead, as well as my own deadly fatigue. Pressing my forehead against my cushioned legs, I tried my best to doze off, but to no avail. I needed to stretch out. Even old Franzel was restless. Pill had evidently given up trying to sleep as a useless occupation. He was absorbed in a conversation with Willie, which they were carrying on in a whisper. Most of the other boys were sound asleep, some in the most uncomfortable positions. It was evident that these frontline veterans had been in worse conditions. But now we had joined them. We were among those who would be called our heroes when we returned home. So we were going to be heroes. A beguiling word, even enchanting. We storm a city, and in a few hours the whole world will know about all this, and when I return home my family and friends will say, "Our Benno was there. He was in that snow." And if I get an award, everyone will whisper in awe, "See that guy over there? That's a real man." And if I die, it will be a glorious death, the death of a hero on the battlefield. Besides, a man can't live forever, and no real man dies in bed. Take the obituary, honorably departed. Well, let them, my parents can rightfully say, sacrificed a son in the name of the fatherland. I knew there wasn't a word of truth in all this. My parents would be heartbroken, not at all proud of me. What about this death of a hero and so on? I remembered Sergeant Worm and that cook from Hamburg lying on the road, and that ghastly pile of bodies in the shelter just a few hours ago. They had to be picked to pieces with a spade in order to bury them. And what about those 3 hanged men? The way they were swinging on their ropes, the girl's blonde hair over her naked body, and those bluish legs. God Almighty, why must we all become heroes? But here we have no choice. Most of us were sure they were going to be killed. But which one of us? Maybe that dark-haired regular army soldier who scrunches his nose in his sleep, or that grunting bloke with his head stretched out like a bullet, with 4 days stubble on his face, or that chunky-eared sergeant. Maybe it'll turn out to be red-haired Willie, or even myself. But who? Enough, I said to myself, enough of this agonizing speculation. What does the Sheikh say at times like this? If it stinks, mate, hold your bloody nose. There he is squatting, the rascal, and sleeping sweetly in spite of everything. His hat has slipped down over his nose, and his fingers are interlaced in the manner of a buckle on his imposing belly. One of the neighbors turned and pushed him. The Sheikh muttered something angrily and poked the fellow, but the old servant continued to snore, though he changed his posture. Sheikh then sat up straight as a bolt, blinking, and yawned until tears welled up in his eyes. Nodding in the direction of the front line, he looked at me meaningly and said, "What a hell of a rumble." Only now I noticed that the noise there had become much more intense. The rumbling was now continuous. The explosions of the heavier shells made our candles shake, as if they too were afraid. "Night attack," said a man with a bandaged head, the bandages on which had already become dirty. The Sheikh leaned forward. "How far is it from here?" he asked in a whisper. "Well, I think it's about 2.5 kilometers, he replied, stretching his words. "But if these guys have broken through, we might as well take up positions right here." Pill turned round. "What kind of unit is this, anyway?" he asked. The man made himself comfortable. He leisurely took out a short pipe with a bitten mouthpiece. "What unit? Believe it or not, it's the base of a motorized regiment. We're from the 3rd Battalion. He paused. "I suppose you'll be wondering where the bloody lorries are. Well, they're gone. The Russians destroyed them all. All we've got now are horse-drawn sleighs. We actually like them better." He had the same slow way of speaking as Kovac. Pill pointed his thumb at the window. "What's it really like out there anyway? Is it always like this?" The man with the bandage gave a curt chuckle and looked us over one by one. "You guys have never been to the front before. Well, all I can say is, you'll have a hell of a good time." He stared thoughtfully at his little pipe and continued, "No, there's no need to panic at all. You'll soon get used to it. And it's not as bad as it looks from here." The thin, bushy-eyed, bearded field felon raised himself up and leaned over, leaning on his long, bony arms. "What are you talking about, you fool? It's not so bad. I never knew you were a fool. Listen to him. It's not that bad. Why don't you tell him why you have that rag on your skull?" When his opponent answered nothing, he went on. "Very well, then let me tell you. It was a direct hit. Corton got off with a scratch, but 5 men from our company were gone. Olk was one of them, a veteran. Always said he'd never get hit. He had a right to say that. He had an old mum left with no one to look after her. "Are you done, Sander?" grumbled the man with the bandage. But the big-eyed man kept talking. "Last summer, we beat the Russians to a pulp, almost playfully. Then came the cold and snow, where they were in their element. Now they're attacking, and we're floundering here in snowdrifts all day and moaning from the bitter cold. We've been like this for months. We've been taking casualties after casualties. Do you hear that noise? Night attacks. That's what the Russians are good at. But I'm telling you, it's like fighting a shadow. And before you know it, you've got a knife between your ribs. And then they're tanks. Corton wanted to say, but Xander shook his head indignantly and raised his voice. Have you ever seen a tank with a Soviet star on it in motion? If not, you'll have something to look at. And when you hear the clanking of their tracks and throw yourself into the snow, you'll remember me. And you'll also remember that little brat here who says it's not so bad at the front. You can't escape the thought that this monster is coming right at you. It's creeping forward very slowly, only a meter a second, but it's coming right at you. And there's nothing you can do about it. Your rifle is useless. You might as well spit on your palm. Besides, it doesn't even occur to you to shoot. You just freeze like a mouse, even though you feel like screaming in terror. You're afraid to lift a finger lest you anger the beast. You say to yourself, maybe you'll be lucky, maybe he won't notice you, maybe his attention is diverted to something else. But then a new thought arises that suddenly luck is turned away from you, and he crawls right into your trench, and you are dead or alive. That's when you need nerves as strong as steel cables. I saw Hansman, 9th Company, fall under the tracks of a T-34. He hadn't dug himself a deep enough trench. He was too tired to dig. The tank turned slightly off its course, exactly enough to remove a layer of earth, and irked him lengthwise. In the next minute, the man was level to the ground. The window shuddered slightly. In the sudden silence, Corton, the guy with the bandaged head, was puffing on his pipe. Then he asked, "Where are you fellows from?" "Supply base, rear guard." "Have you been transferred?" Pill took a confused gulp of air. "We asked to be transferred," he said at last. That line made Xander perk up. "What am I hearing? You asked to come here? Jesus Christ, I'm going to die laughing." He gave a rude and cynical hoarse chuckle, nervously stroking his groveling face. "So you're one of those fierce idealists, are you? You want to die for the fatherland. Is that your idea? Or do you want to gain laurels for yourself? Playing heroes, perhaps? How would the Iron Cross second class look? A nice little ribbon of honor. Or maybe you'd like an Iron Cross first class. Wouldn't your dads be pleased? Rest assured, you'll get it. I guarantee it." Xander leaned forward, from which the left half of his tunic turned away, and only now we saw several awards above the left breast pocket, the Iron Cross First Class in the middle. Xander removed the order, and with a contemptuous curl of his lips, tossed it to Pill in his lap. "And here's the cross," he said. "You may wear it in your turn." In confusion we looked first at Xander and then at Pill. Pill sat like a statue, staring at the order in amazement, as if it were something otherworldly. God Almighty, what kind of man was this Xander? Kovac then picked up the cross and tossed it back to Xander. "Be careful, you big-eyed saint," he grumbled in his droning voice. "Leave these guys alone. They're the best. Trust me. Don't get burned on this." But Xander only grinned and lay back down. Then the chubby sergeant from across the room intervened. "It's about time you stupid bastards shut up. Your grumbling is getting on people's nerves. Why the hell don't you all go to bed?" We fell to the floor again. The sheik burped loudly. Franzel stretched out and snored. The thunder of heavy guns was not distant. I could feel the floor trembling. For a moment, Xander sat up again and gave us an attentive frown. Then someone blew out the last candle. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Suddenly, I felt something was wrong. It was quieter. The distant rumbling was gone. The window panes no longer rattled. There were only isolated explosions. I looked at my watch. It was 3 o'clock. I should be fast asleep. Someone opened the door. Fresh air rushed in, piercing like a knife. The head-to-toe shrouded figure of a man with a machine gun appeared and shouted, "Everybody line up at once." This did not sound like a rude "get up" from the lips of the petty officer in the barracks. It sounded more like the invitation of a maid to announce that dinner was served. All the same, everyone jumped up at once, putting on overcoats and uniforms. Full cartridge bags pulled down like pieces of lid. The icy wind blew all sleep from our eyes. We lined up in columns of 3. Sharp commands sounded. To the right. At ease, quick march. The night was pitch black. The chill wind penetrated to the very bones. We turned up our collars. No one spoke a word. The only sounds were the crunching of snow and the metallic sound of bayonets catching on sapper blades. Then the news was whispered through the column. They've broken through. A palpable menace hung in the air. Ahead, white flashes were constantly shooting up into the sky. They flickered like burning stars overhead. The machine gun rang out in short bursts. Separate rifle shots rang out. We marched up to these flashes, then turned and stretched in a line along the edge of the forest. A command ran through the column. Dig in. One of the old soldiers showed us how deep the trench should be. Throw the snow so that a rampart is formed, he said. It was impossible to dig in properly. The frozen ground was too hard. I took turns digging with Franzel. One digging, the other on guard. Rifle at the ready. Soon a low wall of hard snow protected us from the front. There was no sign of a single Russian, but we were not at all eager to receive a baptism of fire. Individual shots had ceased, but flashes continued to appear without stopping. The rockets were fired from short-barreled signal pistols. A muffled whining sound, and the blinding fire with hissing soared into the sky, stopped for a moment at maximum height, and again, slowly fading, descended to the ground. The whole space in front of us was awash with light. The wandering shadows were reminiscent of the afterlife. Again and again I thought I saw some movement, noted some vague outline, but it always turned out to be a stump or a bush. All the outlines were so unreal, as if from a bizarre, frightening dream. Several hours passed. It was beginning to dawn in the east. Weary of the long gaze into the darkness, we found our attention gradually waning. So I was startled when someone approached us from the side. Halt! I shouted, and instantly raised my rifle. Who's coming? Hey! Shouted someone tall. Don't shoot. It was a non-commissioned officer, a real giant, with huge bushy eyebrows and a neatly trimmed mustache. Are you one of the recruits who arrived last night? That's right. My answer sounded overly military in this situation. We were no longer on the training ground. The giant grinned. Calm down. Come on, I have a job for you at the command observation post. We took Kovac, Willie, Pill, and Shaik with us. A group of regular army soldiers were already waiting for us. Among them, I recognized Xander. An officer came up and said that Sergeant Vogt would show us the way. We were told to move with extreme caution. No one knew the exact location of the Russian positions. We made our way with the caution of Indians with the giant Vogt in front. The front was once again revitalized. The enemy artillery opened a barrage of fire on the terrain. A couple of machine guns started up. The day promised to be sunny and clear. Flying weather, someone said with disgust. We had to pass a battery of howitzers manned by Croatian artillerymen. They waved cheerfully and suddenly fired a salute over our heads. The rumbling of the guns made us awestruck. We covered our ears with our fists and opened our mouths. Then we cursed those Croats, and they laughed with laughter. A few seconds later, something heavy suddenly flew at us with a howl. We threw ourselves into the snow like lightning. The shell fell behind us, and its target was clearly these gunners. We newcomers were the only ones who tried to take cover. All the others, apparently former frontline soldiers, remained unperturbed. Xander was full of contempt. What's the matter? Morning prayer, he said, stretching the words. But the huge Vogt smiled at us. What flew over us with a howl is no danger, he said calmly. Such a shell always falls exactly behind our positions. After a short pause, it happened again. This time I stayed on my feet, but I had to summon up all my willpower, and Willie dived into the snow. The shrapnel explosion came just close to the Croatian battery. These guys were just taking a new position when the explosion of the third shell killed 2 of them. Now the whole unit was running away. The next shell hit right in the center of the position they were occupying. Several German fighter planes were flying above us. Then we also saw some Russian aeroplanes. These are fighters, Rata, informed us a high non-commissioned officer. Just at that time appeared Messerschmitt. Why do not they shoot at each other? Surprised Pill. This is your train of thought, said Vogt, stomping. But the Russian is happy not to be bothered, and our fighters do not get into a deadloop contest with the rats. Our planes are faster, but the rats are too damn maneuverable. The rats left us alone. Apparently, they had a better target in mind. Down the slope we saw several small houses, almost undamaged. Vogt told us to wait and disappeared into a house with a 10th Company sign on the door. Let's all go inside. One by one we went in. The room was filled with about 20 regular army soldiers squatting or lying on the floor, some cleaning their rifles or playing cards, others dozing. On the hard bedpost sat a lean, short-cropped man of about 35, wearing a gray jumper. A long face with a prominent chin complemented a pince-nez. This was our new commander, and Vogt called him Herr Oberleutnant. The thin man gave us a critical look. We stood at attention and called our names loudly and quickly, but we did not seem to make a favorable impression. Without rising from the bed, he said curtly, "If you don't mind, I'd like to see you more energetic. You came in here as if you were tired veterans, and you haven't done a damn thing yet. You'll realize things are different here. How long have you been in the service, by the way?" That was too much. Barely containing my anger, I said, "We were in a supply unit for 6 months. Then we volunteered for the front." "Volunteered, you say?" The tone of his voice softened a little. "In that case, you don't need to explain what's going on here. The fate of Germany depends on units like this. We do not ask the question of what will happen to us. It's a matter for the whole nation." He probably wanted to say something else, but instead he sighed and looked at us intently. "So, you're volunteers," he summarized. "That's right, volunteers, Herr Oberleutnant. That's commendable. Then I have nothing more to say. I hope we'll get along well together. I'll tell you right away, I won't tolerate sloppiness. All right, Xander and you 3 will stay here for now. You'll be in the 1st platoon. Xander will brief you on everything. The next 4 of you report next door to Sergeant Hegelberg. The rest of you go to the 3rd platoon. Divide the men, Vogt, and take command of the company as before. I dare to make a request. Herr Oberleutnant, can't the 6 of us stay together? Because—" "What's the matter, sucker?" shouted the thin lieutenant angrily. "Special privileges so early. Consider yourself lucky to be in the same company. Not another word. Now get out." Franzel and Kovic stayed with me. Pill and Scheik were in the 2nd platoon. Willie was in the 3rd. I caught Willie's anxious look at me and shrugged. There was nothing to be done about it at the moment. The thin lieutenant asked if I knew how to handle a machine gun. "Yes, I do," I replied. "Then go and replace the soldier on the anti-aircraft machine gun over there." I went to take the bloody duty. The old soldier was as happy as Petrushka at the fair when he saw me. "A shift. That's great. Now I have time to sleep. But who the hell are you?" "I've never seen you before." I told him who I was, and that we were the new recruits. "Reinforcements. That's just what we need. My name is Brodenfeld. The old man sent you here." "Yeah, he's got quite a temper, doesn't he?" Brodenfeld laughed without parting his lips. "I suppose it didn't take him long to give you a headbutt. He always does that with newcomers. He's tough old Welty. No one can resist him." Brodenfeld looked up at the sky. "On the other hand," he said, "the lieutenant's a hell of a nice bloke. He's our company commander. Don't let him down. Then you'll get what you want. I'm off. Keep your eyes open. I'm sure the Russians will be here any minute." Without much enthusiasm, I checked the machine gun. It had been adapted for anti-aircraft sights and mounted on a tripod. It had been a long time since I'd picked up a machine gun like that. This one had a drum instead of a belt. I checked the material and the sighting mechanism. I kept worrying that the Russians were coming. But hour after hour passed, and there were no Russian planes in sight. A squadron of dive bombers, Stuka, gleamed high in the sky. Bomb after bomb, they dropped on their way to the enemy positions. Messerschmitts and Heinkel with howling passed over us. It was a great day for the Luftwaffe. But the Russians seemed unwilling to take any chances and did not show themselves. In spite of the sun, which had already reached its zenith, I felt terribly cold, so I kept running round in circles and stamping my feet. It was time, I thought, for someone to take over. I hoped the old man hadn't forgotten about me. Besides, I began to feel hungry. Just then I heard the rumble of an aeroplane. Another squadron of Junkers. Damn it, I think it's the Russians. Quite a lot of fighters. The clumsy planes kept bunching up like they were having fun out there. Maybe we should give them some heat. Better not. They wouldn't find it amusing. After all, they didn't seem to have chosen us as their target. But when they were almost over us, one of the aeroplanes separated from the others, made a turn, and spiraled steeply, firing all its barrels straight at our houses. I trembled with fear and excitement. I flashed a thought of climbing into cover when somewhere close by an anti-aircraft gun started talking. So I wasn't alone, I thought encouragingly. Still nervous, I took the safety off and selected a target. The fighter soared steeply, then banked, and came at us a second time. This time it singled me out, its propellers buzzing like an angry giant hornet. I could see the fire from its barrels, and the next instant there was a whoosh and a rain of bullets raining down with a thud all around me. Had he hit me? My knees trembled. There he was in the crosshairs of my sight. Pull the trigger. Now. The machine gun had a terrible recoil, but as the bullets were fired, I forgot my fears and the pain in my shoulder. Now I had only one thought: to destroy this fire-spewing insect. I stuck to the shuddering machine gun and shot away at the damned aircraft as best I could. Then the weapon suddenly jammed. Or did it? No, the magazine was empty. The enemy plane flew over, almost hitting my head, and disappeared behind the slope, and as if it was leaving behind a faint plume of smoke. Well, that nightmare was behind me, and I took a deep breath. My knees were suddenly wet. This was no joke after all. At least I'd made it through. Maybe the plane had crashed further away, out of sight. Still, I'd shown the blokes around here I could defend my territory. They must have been watching from their windows, and I imagined them congratulating me. Then another bloke came to me, hunched over like an old man. "You can go now," he said briefly. "I'm your replacement." I was surprised that he had no comment on my shooting, and said as casually as possible, "I think I hit him." He was fuming. The chap made no reply at first. Finally, he grumbled unhappily. "Why the hell did you leave the magazine empty? You think the damn thing charges itself." I returned to the flat, badly hurt. Franzel told me that when I was firing, he was the only one paying attention. Oh yeah, there was another guy. He'd been asleep the whole time, but when this Russian was showering the roof with a hail of bullets, he got a piece of plaster on his face. That's what woke him up. He saw you from the window and said it would look a hell of a lot more spectacular if you had a machine gun belt, because there wasn't enough ammo in those pathetic drums. I thought I was being heroic. Now I realized that I blundered. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Here we are. Someone was standing in the aisle, stomping to shake the snow off their boots. First I saw the boots, then the overcoat covered in snow, and then the face under the officer's cap, and I jumped up as if from an electric shock. "Mr. Lieutenant." He looked at me and Franzel. "My God, I can't believe it. Honestly, how did you get here? Let's shake hands, you rascals." That was Straub, Lieutenant Straub, who was our officer back at the training camp. "Herr Lieutenant," I said. "Galen, Jundling and Scholes are here too." Unfortunately, they were assigned to different platoons. Couldn't we all be in your platoon? I suppose we'll soon sort that out. Imagine that. 5 musketeers. How did you manage that? We went to another house, partially damaged but empty, so we could talk in peace. Franzel rushed after the others. It was a great reunion. Straub told us that he had been transferred to this company with a large number of freshly trained recruits from our former unit, but that many of them had already been killed in action. In turn, we told him what had happened to us. Straub now and then interjected his remarks into the conversation. He listened to most of our story with great interest. When we spoke of the sufferings of the Russian prisoners, he said, "Many things cannot be prevented, but, frankly speaking, I have very often been ashamed of being a German." That evening, we received orders to be on standby. We had to replace another company. We were now in Straub's platoon. He had arranged it with Welty. We also had the pudgy-eyed Zander with us. When Straub saw Zander, their meeting was heated. They were obviously old friends, and Straub seemed to have a high opinion of Zander. We were quite surprised that a hardened pessimist like Zander and the poised but energetic Straub had such a good relationship. I was given a machine gun and Franzel was made second in command. Sheikh was beyond angry when he was made ammunition carrier. We were about to leave when the Russians opened a barrage of artillery fire on our huts so that we ran out of them like scalded men. Only the company headquarters stayed put. There was no way we would have wanted to change places with the staffers. Then followed an hour and a half of stealthy marching, after which we were right on the front line. The terrain sloped down to form a ravine. The Russian machine gun nests were on the opposite side. We were divided into groups of 2 and detached to one of the dugouts, which were placed at intervals of about 25 meters along the edge of our side of the ravine. With mixed feelings, we took up positions in unprotected little trenches as deep as our thighs, where we were met by several regular army soldiers, blue with cold. They were glad to be changed. "What a bunch of villains you are," they said. "What took you so long to show up?" The wretched moon cast a pale, cold light on the snowy landscape. On the other side of the ravine, we saw machine gun bursts. Bullets whistled over our heads. "If they think this will scare us, they've got the wrong people," Franzel said. We calculated the distance to the target, set our sights, and answered with our MG-34s. Every 6th round was a tracer, and the plume of fire highlighted the exact spot where we'd seen the enemy's flashes of fire. The Russian machine guns snapped back viciously, and a desperate duel began. Every time the fire was on their side, we ducked our heads. They shot damnably well. Gradually, we lost interest in this duel and gave up. They stopped firing, too. I covered my machine gun with a tarpaulin to keep out the snow, which the gusty wind was beginning to whip up. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, we tried to keep warm by patting each other on the back, as we had done before. At 3, we cursed the mocking brilliance of the stars, the cold moon, the Russians, and this dirty war that had lifted us from our warm beds. At 5, we were stiff with cold and so exhausted that we could hardly keep from falling asleep. After another 2 hours, Lieutenant Straub jumped into our trench. "How about doing a little reconnaissance?" "Jesus, sure. That'll keep us warm. Anything to get out of this trench." "Fine," Straub said. "In an hour and a half at company headquarters, and there's hot coffee waiting for you there." We waddled on stiff legs to the shelter. There we met Zander and Sheikh and Vogt, a giant non-commissioned officer, and 3 other soldiers I didn't know. We drank hot coffee, and cheerfulness of spirit returned to us. We put on white uniforms to be invisible in the snow, and when we followed the lieutenant, we forgot about the cold, about that terrible night. We walked along the whole edge of the ravine, then went down the slope to no man's land. There was no sign of either enemy positions or ours. Only occasional shells shot randomly across the terrain. It is very unpleasant when you are between 2 firing positions and think how soon you will be detected by the enemy. The lieutenant pointed to a branching ravine and explained our task in a whisper. At the end of the ravine was a village. We were to find out whether it was in Russian hands, and if so, how large a force was holding it. All the senses were sharpened, and the guns at the ready at the hip. We moved cautiously, listening for the slightest sound. Suddenly, the village was right in front of us. We hid and tried to get our bearings before moving on. Xander had a stomachache. "I don't know what's wrong," he said. "I don't feel well." But before he could say anything else, Sheikh interrupted him. "I know what you mean. It's a bloody, unpleasant feeling. I had that once when I drank a lot of beer with cucumbers." Vogt wrinkled his nose like he was going to sneeze, but he just laughed. We all laughed, and it took the edge off. We felt better now. Only Xander kept complaining, as if he'd never been interrupted. And his words echoed in my ears. "It feels weird inside, guys," he said. "We're going to get caught in a bind tonight. I'm sure they've blocked our escape route. I bet we're trapped, don't you?" No one answered, but no one laughed either. The lieutenant took the binoculars and looked closely at the village. "Xander," he said, "look over there, up ahead. Is that a man or a dog lying on the road?" Xander put the binoculars to his eyes. "You need glasses," he joked. "It's a man, quite obviously, and he's lying on his back. Must have been murdered." "We'll have to go into the village," Straub said. "Into the village?" Xander exclaimed mockingly. "Do you think I'm crazy? Do you want to find a nice corner for a mass grave or a free trip to Siberia?" The lieutenant continued to stare nonchalantly through his binoculars. After a while, as if he suddenly had an idea, he said, "Shut up, Xander. That's the speech of a rebel. I'm as sick of you as a boil in my arse. You can stay here if you're so afraid." Xander ran the back of his hand over his beard, his lips curling into a sinister grin. We made our way cautiously along the edge of the village. Ready for any surprise, we surveyed the first hut. Empty, abandoned. It was the same everywhere else. It seemed as if the inhabitants had suddenly left the village all at once. In many huts we found uneaten food on the tables. Pots of meat chowder hung over extinguished hearths. Most of the doors were wide open. It all looked very strange and ominous. Xander was right. The man lying in the road was dead. A civilian. His skull was fractured, his face contorted with a grimace of horror. In the distance, we saw 2 more dead. Then in the hut, we came upon a woman bent over a table, as if she were dozing. Her head had been shot through. Nearby lay an uneaten piece of bread with butter, and a bloodstain on it, as if it had been jam. What tragedy had been played out here? We looked on in profound silence. It was as if we had stepped on forbidden ground. We involuntarily turned to whispers, and our voices sounded hoarse. We were now making our way towards the manor house at the back of the road. Xander and Sheikh stepped forward to inspect it. The lieutenant said that we would soon be moving back, our task accomplished. There was no particular need, he said, to look in all the other houses. I was just about to follow the other 2 into the peasant's house when Franzel suddenly nudged me with his elbow in great excitement. Look over there." At the same instant the lieutenant commanded in a whisper, "Hurry to cover. Behind that house. Come on." Russians. I ran for the house with all my legs, and there I was, out of breath, standing behind the wall, my heart pounding hard. It was clear that the Russians had discovered us, and were hiding behind the nearest huts. No doubt a group of scouts like us. Carefully, centimeter by centimeter, I'd brought my machine gun forward. Then Sheikh and Xander suddenly appeared in the doorway. "Look out!" I shouted to them. "Get in here." Sheikh was so dazed that he hesitated for a moment, but Xander instantly assessed the situation and threw himself to the ground, dragging Sheikh with him. Bullets, apparently fired from automatic rifles, rained down on the wall. Xander, wriggling like a marten, reached us, but before the lanky Sheikh reached the wall that sheltered us, he twisted in pain and grabbed his leg with a roar. Franzel sprang at him with lightning speed, put his arm round him, and dragged him to us, while the bullets were pounding the wall in an endless hail and whistling overhead. The Sheikh was wounded in the upper thigh. One of our regular army soldiers was trained in first aid. He cut along the trouser leg of Sheikh's leg and ripped open his underpants. The wound looked terrible. The snow was stained red. The rescuer calmly bandaged Sheikh. Sheikh roared in pain, his face contorted with a grimace. Then he suddenly calmed down at once. "What a devilish mess," he said. "Damn scoundrels." Thank God, he had regained his composure. "He'll be all right." The rescuer continued his work, only smirking when Sheikh's tongue got out of control. Meanwhile, I had my machine gun ready and was ready to fire. "Wait." The lieutenant stopped me with a gesture. "Maybe we shouldn't show them that we have a machine gun right now." The Russians were spreading out, surrounding us in a big arc. They intended to flank us. The situation was getting more hopeless by the minute. We were forced to huddle together, and the weak cover gave us no chance of escape. To top it all off, we had a wounded man, and the Russians looked at us like hawks at prey. Franzel put his steel helmet on a stick and stuck it out from behind a corner, and a hail of bullets followed the flash. Now the bullets were whistling from the side, right next to his ear. "If this keeps up, they're going to get us in the crossfire." Straub had a word with Zander and Sergeant Vogt. Then he turned to me. "Listen carefully. 3 of us will try to outflank the Russians. You will cover us with fire. The rest of us will show them what we can do. If the plan succeeds, we can drive them right into your hands. But for God's sake, don't manage to shoot at your own men. Feldfebel, you'll take command here." Zander collected all our hand grenades and shared them with Vogt and the lieutenant. We took aim at the points where we thought the Russians would be. "Ready?" asked the lieutenant. "Yes, sir." Zander was suddenly transformed. His voice sounded firm and clear, and he stopped slouching. The contemptuous grimace was gone from his lips. The lieutenant was giving his final instructions. "All right, let's go. Continuous fire." There was a deafening rumble. I used up 2 machine gun ribbons without a single misfire. The others raised their heads just enough to fire their carbines like crazy. Even the wounded Sheikh was shouting at the top of his voice. "That's the talk. Give them some heat, you lousy bastards. Give them a light." The Russians fled. They didn't dare to take any more risks. The unexpected attack took them by surprise. Pieces of plaster bounced off the houses, and the snow on the road rose, swirling under the impact of the bullets. Straub, Zander, and Vogt reached the last houses and disappeared from sight. Franzel snatched up a replacement barrel he had brought with him, and we quickly replaced the red-hot barrel of the machine gun. Just as I began to aim again, I saw a Russian running across the road and toppled him with a coup halfway across. Another cautiously sprang up, but before he came out of cover, I gave a short cue right under his nose, and he fell again. I then kept up a steady fire on them, Franzel passing me ribbon after ribbon. The Feldfebel put his hand on my shoulder. "Careful," he said. "I've just spotted one of ours over there. I think they've already got the Russians in the rear." But in the meantime, the Russians had regrouped and were showering us with a hail of bullets, so we had to take cover behind the wall. Minutes of tense waiting followed, and we wondered whether we had managed to get through it all. Suddenly there was a thud, then another, almost merging into a general explosion. Hand grenades. Then fiercely, frantically, like a drumbeat, the automatic rifles began to sound. Their sound was the same as our own. 2 Russians were running right into my line of fire. Quickly I pulled the trigger, and there they were, squirming in the snow. We heard the high, whirring sound of a Russian submachine gun, then a second one, then the explosion of hand grenades again. Suddenly, there was silence. Then came a shriek, followed by a single shot. Then we saw our giant non-commissioned officer in the middle of the road waving his helmet at us. There were 14 Russians, each with a machine gun. 3 were dead, 5 wounded. 1 lay moaning in the snow red with blood. He was hopeless. The Russians who remained unharmed dropped their machine guns and stood waiting with their hands raised, anxiously watching our actions. Straub let them take care of their wounded and distributed their weapons to us. We moved on our way back. In front was Sergeant Vogt, who had a slight bullet wound. Then followed the prisoners, dragging their wounded. The dying man we left on the spot. Despite his protests, Franzel and the rescuer put the Sheikh on an improvised stretcher and carried him. Sheikh protested, saying he could walk on his own if he was supported. "You mourn." Franzel shouted at him, "You'd better shut up. Lie still and shut your mouth." Lieutenant Straub let us pass forward. A moment later we heard a pistol shot. I had been waiting for it. I knew he would do the right thing. Taking his time, he caught up with us. That same day towards evening, the whole company moved in a long winding column towards the village to occupy it. Only the 3rd platoon remained in the same position. Straub said that Franzel and I could stay behind and join the others later. But we wanted to be with our friends and said we didn't need rest. It was not easy to part with old Sheikh. We shook hands and didn't know what to say. Give our best wishes to your family when you get back home. Take care of yourself, old chap. For Pille, the parting seemed to be the hardest part. He had lost his old sparring partner. "Go away," Pille muttered. "It's a damn good thing I won't see you again." But he squeezed his hand so hard that Sheikh grimaced in pain. Welty ordered the attack, but the deployment wasn't so easy. We had to climb steep slopes. We had to get the Russians in a pincer at all costs. Finally, we moved forward. They met us with furious, small arms fire. He was joined by a couple of machine guns. The 2nd platoon was the first to suffer casualties. Without cover, we ran through the snow, occasionally falling in the snow, moving crawling on our stomachs. Once we reached the houses, it would be easier to move. The heavy machine guns allocated to us formed a curtain of fire in front of the village. As soon as they found themselves, they were fired upon. I myself was also firing continuously. The recoil of the guns and the terrible rumbling kept our morale up. They gave us a sense of strength and self-confidence. The outer row of houses became a sieve. There were holes in the walls. Windows were broken out. The Russians began to withdraw. We rushed into the first houses, searched them, and occupied each one with a fight. Several times we met strong resistance, but steadily continued to advance. There were also casualties on our side. I saw Kovac dragging one of our soldiers to cover. His stomach was torn open. A field fibble collapsed, bleeding, at his machine gun. Hand grenades were bursting. Straub pointed to one of the largest houses. I fired at the doors and windows. 5 Russians threw their rifles into the road as a sign that they were surrendering and came out with their hands in the air. Lieutenant Welty ran around waving his pistol and shouting commands. The roof of one of the houses was burning. More and more Russians were surrendering. In some places we still met some resistance, but at last the village was in our hands. The lieutenant immediately set up outposts on the hills along the edge of the village. Welty ordered all the prisoners to be rounded up in the small market square. Many were sure they would be shot, but Welty sent them with a small guard down the ravine to the very end, and they trotted off in a battered mob, head down, carrying or supporting their wounded. We sat on the gas mask crates waiting for further orders. One of the sentries from the outpost came rushing in. "Where's the lieutenant?" "At headquarters, up ahead." "What's the problem?" "The Russians. They're coming this way down the low ground. At least a battalion and 2 tanks." "And he's gone." "Tanks," Kovac grumbled. "That's all we need, and not a single anti-tank gun. We'll have to go again." "You mean it was all for nothing?" Willie moaned. "You'll get used to it," grumbled the old soldier. "This whole bloody campaign doesn't make any sense at all. All we have to do is hit the tanks with concentrated fire," said Pill thoughtfully. "Really?" said Xander wryly. "I suggest you try it. That'll be quite an act." But his sarcasm had lost some of its sharpness. I suddenly got the impression that it was just a mask behind which Xander was hiding his true face, and that he was getting tired of wearing that mask. The lieutenant came up. "Come on, boys, follow me." The village will have to be defended. Orders from the chief. In that case, sighed the old Feldfebel, we have to prepare for the worst. In small groups we entrenched on the outskirts of the village and on the surrounding hills. Lieutenant Welty walked briskly past. Nobody leaves the position, or I'll court-martial you. Franzel, more amazed than angry, just stared dumbfounded. Did that maniac actually say court-martialed? He asked. The Russians were arriving in large haphazard groups. They filled the entire low ground. 2 tanks, apparently T-34s, were slowly but surely creeping towards the village. They now appeared to be the size of matchboxes. Sergeant Bacchus, having selected positions for his heavy machine guns, was excitedly scurrying from one to the other, giving final instructions. These machine guns were to fire from our side. No one was to fire until then. I lay down in a thicket of bushes, which served as excellent cover. Franzel handed me a cartridge belt, and Kovac kept a sharp eye on the approaching enemy through Xander's binoculars. The Russians were regrouping for an attack. Xander seemed to have lost interest in what was happening. He leaned against a tree and was absorbed in his thoughts. I could see that he was staring at the sky in the west, where the setting sun was filling the increasing black mass of clouds with scarlet light. "Hey, Xander." I called out, but I had to call out again before he heard. "For God's sake, wake up. What's wrong with you?" Xander jumped up and gave me a worried look. "Huh? What's wrong?" he questioned me. When I didn't answer immediately, he pointed to the sun with a nod and said reverently, as if he had just made a remarkable discovery, "Look at that blazing sunset. When we were children, we thought it was angels baking bread." I couldn't believe my ears. Was it really that Xander, the cynical Xander? The cavalry. It was unbelievable. What a suicidal idea. Suddenly, dozens of red horsemen appeared and rushed into a frontal attack. With that, the Russian attack began. The next moment, our heavy machine guns started firing. There was an infernal rumble, and a rain of lead fell on the attackers. Their horses were a splendid target, prancing, kicking, falling, or being carried. The riders flew out of their saddles, some caught their foot in the stirrup, and the maddened animals dragged them through the snow. The attack slammed down as suddenly as it had begun. The few Russians who survived the first bursts slid to the ground and tried to hide behind the backs of their horses. Evidently, they had in no way anticipated any resistance on our part. But their infantry came, and the Russian machine guns banged like mad. The air became dense with bullets and grenades, which filled it with the whistling of bullets and grenades. The figures of the huddled men came inexorably towards us. I caught sight of the one closest to me and grabbed the machine gun. Having received a dose of my fire, no one else came up. It seemed to hear the bullets hitting human bodies, but there was no consciousness of killing, destroying human lives. On the contrary, it was even exhilarating. I had always thought that killing would be more difficult. Suddenly, we found ourselves under fire from the flank. Shit, the Russians had taken the hills. I heard someone shouting very close to me. It was a Feldfebel who had joined our reconnaissance platoon. I deployed my machine gun and opened fire on the slope. The lieutenant shouted, "Careful retreat. Take cover behind the houses." There was a deafening explosion. We looked at each other in horror. What in God's name was that? "Look out! The tanks are firing," shouted Xander. God almighty, tanks. They're already a few hundred meters away. Franzel hastily inserted a new cartridge strip. We fired at the hills again, but the soldiers who were there were hiding. The guys next to us, including Pill, Kovac, and Willie, took advantage of the pause and rushed towards the houses. Then the machine gun jammed. I pulled back the cover and pulled out the belt. Franzel pulled the jammed cartridge out of the belt with steady finger movements. There was a burst of shrapnel, and the trunk of the nearest tree snapped off like a match. One of the machine gunners next to me bent in half and fell face first into the snow. A fragment ricocheted near my helmet. I used up another belt in my machine gun, then hurriedly followed Franzel to the houses. There I found the field fibble I had seen in the morning. He was lying motionless. "What's the matter with him?" I asked Xander. Xander calmly reloaded his gun. He didn't even look up. "It's over," he muttered. "Shot through the lungs." Now the shrapnel explosions were more frequent. Our second heavy machine gun was shattered. Thick smoke billowed from one of the houses, like prehistoric monsters, tumbling heavily across the road. 2 tanks were approaching us, and the infantry, sheltering behind their impenetrable steel, were crowding in tight ranks. Our 2 remaining heavy machine guns kept firing, but the bullets just bounced off the armor without doing any damage, like water droplets on a hard surface. All we could do was force the soldiers behind the tanks to close ranks tighter. We had to leave the first row of houses behind. The Russians were establishing their bridgehead in the village. This caused a second fight for every house that day. But this time the battle was fiercer and the casualties heavier on both sides. Everything around was strewn with the corpses of our soldiers, and we had to work tirelessly, dragging the wounded away under the bullets whipping the snow around them. The Russians went on the attack from the hills, attacking from the flank, occupying one house after another. As the tanks came at us, we steadily gave up ground. The air was constantly shaken by explosions. We flinched at every rumble. It felt like our heads were going to explode. I felt like I had lost my weapon and was burying myself in the ground. "We have to finish those tanks," the lieutenant muttered through clenched teeth. "That's our only hope." Xander lowered his machine gun and peered round the corner of the house, threw back his helmet, and picked up a couple of hand grenades. "Concentrated charge," he said. "Tie a bunch of these grenades to a stick. It's a long shot, but why not try?" He sounded like he'd been thinking about it for a long time. "All right, let's go," Straub ventured. They found 2 long sticks and tied a bunch of hand grenades to the end of each stick. A slight grin appeared on Xander's face. "That'll be something to write home to those armored bastards about," he grumbled. "Give us some covered fire," the lieutenant said. Franzel took my place at the machine gun and kept pressing the trigger for continuous firing. Several Russians, who were not too close to the tank that was covering them, were hit in the neck by bullets. We were supported by another heavy machine gun. It was a favorable moment. Xander and the lieutenant rushed forward at the tanks, holding their long sticks with their deadly loads. I inserted ribbon after ribbon into the machine gun and opened a new ammunition box. Then the machine gun jammed. We switched barrels, and the machine gun worked again. It was getting dark. Everything was blurred like in a fog. It was difficult to distinguish our own from strangers, but the fight did not stop, and the noise of it did not subside for a moment. Machine gun bursts came very close. Apparently, the tanks had noticed us. Then there was a direct hit on the heavy machine gun. The tripod went tumbling and fell on the body of the dead machine gunner. His comrade moaned and cried for help. The clanking of the tracks of the inexorably advancing tank was heard. Some houses were already engulfed in flames. Suddenly, the ground shook as if from the impact of a blockbuster bomb, and a column of flame soared into the sky. Straub and Xander had acted. A moment later followed the impact of a second bunch of grenades. For a moment, everything seemed to calm down, as if both sides were taking stock of the situation. But suddenly, the clanking of the tracks resumed, and one of the enemy gunners began to aim his infernal sights at us. "God Almighty, Franzel, for Christ's sake, shoot! Fire everything you've got. We've got to get those 2 back in one piece." Franzel's body seemed to merge with the machine gun. One of our soldiers staggered past, leaving a trail of blood behind him. The shrapnel had torn off his palm. He held the stump in front of him, staring at it as if he couldn't believe what had happened. There was a blinding flash and an explosion right across the front, and hot iron burned my shoulder. "Let's go," Franzel shouted. I jumped up, and together we managed to get to the nearest house. Xander appeared, striding across the road with huge strides. He stopped and looked around, trying to see us. "This way, Xander, this way," we shouted. Another explosion and Xander spun on his heels, His legs gave out and he slumped to the ground. I went over to him and saw that he was dead. His bulging eyes were glazed over, but his expression was almost peaceful. His half-open mouth seemed to be smiling. His helmet had been pierced through. The razor-sharp edge bent inwards, digging into his skull. Lieutenant Straub came back. One of the tanks was out of action, but the other didn't seem to be badly damaged. I couldn't get close enough, he said. Where's Xander? Xander's dead, I said, and a lump came up in my throat. He's in the house. Straub was stunned. He turned on stiff legs and walked inside. We had run out of ammunition, and now we were only firing short bursts. Mortars began to probe us. Lieutenant Welty ordered us to go back to our original position. First platoon, lead the way. We slowly made our way back along the ravine. Our small rear guard remained behind. The firing gradually quieted down in the distance. Even the sound of shrapnel explosions began to seem harmless. We did not utter a word, but the groans and intermittent breathing of the wounded remained with us. The dead we left behind us. Only the lieutenant was dragging something across the frozen snow. Something shapeless, wrapped in a trench coat. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Exhausted, we collapsed into the old trenches. The shift, we learned, would not arrive for several more hours. Until then, we would have to endure. Ammunition arrived. We mechanically filled magazines, cleaned our automatic rifles, placed grenades so that they would be at hand. We were dead tired. It became cold in the night. It was as icy cold as the previous night. Had it really only been 24 hours since we had come to these trenches and anxiously awaited our baptism of fire? One single day had been so full of fighting that we had come to accept it as normal and had relied entirely on fate. But where was that sense of pride in knowing that we were fighting on the front line? All we knew was, at least for the moment, we weren't fighting, and damn glad of it. Now we dreaded the coming morning, every coming day. The cold was merciless. It incomprehensibly permeated everything around us, and we gave up. We were too exhausted to move. We just huddled in the snow and stared stupidly in front of us, trying to keep our eyes open for fear of making a fatal mistake and falling asleep. My feet were slowly turning to ice and had completely lost sensation. I knew I had to do something about it, but it was so infinitely peaceful to remain motionless. There were no more shrapnel explosions, no more whistling bullets, no more screams of the wounded, and when I put my head on my knees and put all thoughts out of my mind, the cold was no longer so excruciating. Of course, I wasn't going to fall asleep. I was only thinking of taking a nap. Our shift was about to arrive. A distant village was burning. Why are the tanks still firing? We blew them up, didn't we? The soldiers crouched around were dead, without any signs of life. Xander's glassy eyes. Another bloody machine gun misfire. Look, Franzel, here they come. What's that lieutenant dragging behind him? It's a big doll with real tears coming out of its eyes. I woke up with a jolt. Franzel was mumbling in his sleep, his body twitching. He seemed to be dreaming about last night's horror too. Franzel, for God's sake, wake up. I had to shake him as hard as I could. He couldn't come round for a long time afterwards. Was I asleep? God, I might never have woken up. We struggled to get to our feet and tried to warm up our limbs, but to no avail. I felt like I was walking on stilts. At dawn we were changed. When we received our orders to depart, 3 of our group were not with us. Kovac heard from Sergeant Hofmeister that they froze to death that night. They were stripped and rubbed down with snow, but it was too late. Somebody noticed. Hell of a death, if you ask me. Just freezing to death, that's all. You're asleep, dreaming wonderful dreams, and suddenly it's over. You don't feel the transition at all. And there's no dirt, added another soldier. I would pray to God to freeze to death, came a faint voice. Then I heard Vaux's bass growl. I'd like to see your stupid face if you suddenly discovered you were freezing to death and had nowhere to go. We laughed. Gradually we cheered up. We were glad to go in formation where there was peace and quiet. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. When we returned to the base, we found that as a result of a direct hit, the premises of the heavy machine gun platoon assigned to us had been completely destroyed. All the machine guns had been put out of action. The platoon had to be split up, and the soldiers were distributed among our 3 platoons. Despite this increase in their numbers, the total number of personnel was reduced. There was hot bean soup for lunch, and we pounced on it like a pack of hungry wolves. It was unusually good. I took 2 refills, but when Pill held out his pot for the 4th time, the cook said no more. "Come on," said the good-natured Vogt. "Give the lad another spoonful, you pot-bellied son of a bitch." "But I'm telling you there's nothing left," whimpered the cook. "You've been cooking for the whole company. Damn it," growled the field officer. "You're not going to tell me that you knew in advance that we'd lose 1/3 of our men. It's not my fault you're eating like pigs, is it?" "Well, if there are no more beans, how about chocolate?" Vogt asked. "After all, we're entitled to chocolate rations." "That's none of my business," grumbled the cook. "Ask the supply sergeant about it." A little later the supply sergeant, a feisty fellow with a nutcracker face, came in and announced that we could have our chocolate, but only 1 bar each, and don't think you'll also get a portion of the killed ones. There was much grumbling about this, and as soon as the sergeant turned his back on us, the irritation spilled out. Again, as usual, the same nastiness is repeated. As soon as we have dead men, this pig holds on to their rations. It's always the same with chocolate and cigarettes. What do you think those greedy types do with them? Filling their bellies while we're in the trenches. "Don't be so hasty," said the cook, stammering. "If the old man hears you, there'll be trouble." "Shut your mouth, you fat hog. Next time, if you don't cook enough, you'll end up in the cauldron yourself. You've been fattening up for a long time." The field surgeon came round in the evening that day and asked if anyone had any complaints. I signed in. I had something with my feet. We were taken in a horse-drawn sleigh to the battalion headquarters. It was crowded, and we had to wait for a long time. After several attempts I managed to take off my boots. When I pulled off my socks, large shreds of leather were stuck to them. My toes were covered in blisters, and my heels. God Almighty, what a sight! A rotting open wound, almost black, but not bleeding. The soldier beside me clutched his nose. "Mate," he exclaimed, "you're already rotting. Boy, what a stench." Then the paramedic examined me. Piece by piece, very carefully, he removed the rest of the skin from my feet. "What do you do?" he asked me. "I joined the army right after school, Mr. Felcher," I answered. Was all he said in reply. What is he doing, I thought, as he plunged the forceps deep into my heel. "Do you feel anything?" he asked. "Not much at all." "Well, maybe you were lucky after all," he muttered. Now, I was really worried. One consolation, at least I wouldn't be in this damn race for a while. The medic told me that he would bring me my satchel the next day. I wouldn't be going anywhere until then. "Tell Franzel Ulmer, will you?" I asked him. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Because the field hospital was overcrowded, I was put in a room in a small base unit. The first person I saw there was Corton, a guy with a bandaged head. He was looking at some pictures and talking to a guy with straw-colored hair who looked like a movie star. "What are you doing here?" he exclaimed. "I thought you were at the front." I told him about my frostbite and that I was being hospitalized. When I began to tell him about Xander, he shook his head sadly. So he didn't escape death after all. We thought he was bulletproof. If you ask me, old Xander considered himself a model warrior. He's been acting rather unusual these last few days. "Who is this Xander?" the blonde asked. "You mean the guy with the Iron Cross First Class, the one the Russians captured with Lieutenant Straub." "How so?" exclaimed I. "Were those two captured by the Russians?" "Quite right," said Corton. "Only for a couple of days. Then they made a breach and fought their way back to our position. They must have been terrified. What kind of a man was this Xander? I asked. I could never understand him, Corton replied. But one thing is certain, he was not a whiner, as you might think from his constant complaints about stomach pains. The way he made all you newbies nervous was very characteristic of him. Strange sense of humor. Didn't he once save Straub's life? Film star interjected. That's right. But you see, that's the thing. You could always count on old Xander at the decisive moment. He's done a lot of other things. There's a whole bunch of blokes who'd have relied on Xander. What did he do? I mean, before this damn war. You wouldn't believe it, but he was a bloody artist. He showed me his drawings once. They showed dead soldiers lying around, their bodies horribly disfigured, giving me the creeps. I was shocked, but when I told him about it, he just grinned. But I know one thing. Old Xander hated war more than any of us. Our conversation turned to the subject of furloughs and girls. Corton showed me a picture. Just a pretty girl in a Red Cross medic's uniform. That's Raul's fiancée. The handsome Raul smiled proudly, showing off his white, even teeth. Say, she's good, isn't she? Corton concluded. And still that rascal is after every skirt. There were 2 Russians in our house, a husband and wife. He was about 50 years old. He was a small, stupid-looking man with a long gray beard. His wife was as round as a barrel and had the face of a gorilla. They both slept on a bench near the stove. The bench was long and narrow, so they did not fit side by side, but lay head to foot. At night I needed to go to the lavatory. It was pitch dark, so I lit a match. People were lying all over the place, and I had to be careful not to step on anyone. I lit another match, and what do I see? A pudgy little woman and old Roll lying there, hugging each other tight. He clung to the woman like she was his precious life, so that he wouldn't fall off the narrow bench. And the old bearded man was at their feet and slept the sleep of the righteous. Towards morning I heard a noise. 2 Russians were making up their minds. Finally, the woman took a basket, threw some things in it, smiled embarrassedly, and left. He threw the old bitch out, said the man who knew a little Russian. What did he say to her? Well, he was talking rubbish about dirty business. What kind of dirty business? I have no idea. He didn't say what it was. So the old man didn't fall asleep so fast after all. I kept my mouth shut, of course. As for Raul, he played innocent. Franzel dropped by to say goodbye to me. Pill, Kovac and Willie send their best wishes. He said, Willie asked me to give you his slippers. He says you'll need them in the hospital, but don't wear them out too much. You know how Willie loves those slippers his mom made for him with her own hands. I hesitated to take those slippers. That Willie's a real sweet kid. Maybe you'll meet the sheikh, Franzel said. Drop us a line or 2 about how you're doing. Pakotnitz v. Stalingrad too. I didn't know what to say. I just shook his hand. We look forward to your imminent return. Don't forget we need you here, you know. Lieutenant Straub showed up a little later. Heard about your frostbite. It's not good, I'll tell you that. I don't envy it. But who knows, maybe it's for the best. If they send you to the front again, try to get into our company. That evening the huge sledge with lightly and severely wounded men, a few of each, set off to take us to the field hospital. I, too, sat in them, wrapped in blankets. Suddenly that little gorilla showed up again, with a basket in her hand and an embarrassed smile on her face. The old man looked at her blinking in utter amazement. Then they spoke to each other quite calmly and were soon on their way to the door, hand in hand, in an idyll of marital bliss. Evidently, the night's interlude had been forgotten and the woman forgiven. The sleigh glided towards the evening sunset. The sun was setting, shimmering with enchanting colors. Angels in heaven bake bread, Xander would say. Now Xander was dead, and the survivors were preparing for a new battle. I was partly glad I wasn't with them. Now I had a bit of a peaceful life ahead of me. It was a gift from God, and I knew how I would use it.